If you're considering building or upgrading your PC, you might be wondering what the difference between a GPU and CPU is. These two acronyms refer to two different internal PC components. The CPU, or Central Processing Unit, is a chip that acts as the brain of the computer. It runs all the PC program instructions, reads from and writes to memory, and tells other components what to do. The GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit, is a chip that handles, you guessed it, graphics processing, performing tasks like rendering game frames and encoding videos. In this way, the GPU has a more specific job than the CPU. You can run a PC without a GPU, but a PC without a CPU won't be able to do much. Nevertheless, there are benefits of having a GPU in your system, for example, and probably most importantly for many who are reading. Having a GPU should greatly increase your FPS in games. What is a CPU? A CPU, or Central Processing Unit, is a physical chip inside your PC that computes and executes all the instructions different programs on your PC tell it to. It is, for all intents and purposes, the computer itself. How a CPU works. The CPU processes data that you input via mouse and keyboard and so on, in whatever way the program instructs it to. Your CPU then tells different hardware components what to do based on this processing, perhaps play a sound or display something on screen. For example, it loads program instructions from memory and sometimes executes these instructions in parallel, one instruction at a time on each CPU core. It performs operations at a certain speed which is measured in megahertz or gigahertz. CPU today can execute millions of instructions per second. What is CPU architecture? CPU architecture is just what it sounds like, how the CPU is designed. Just like a building architect designed the layout and structure of a building, a CPU architect designs how the internal components of a CPU come together to make the entire CPU. Different generations of Intel and AMD CPU often share the same architectures. For example, Intel's current 12th Gen CPU are all based on the Alder Lake architecture, and AMD current, though soon to be replaced 5000 series CPU, are all based on the Zen 3 architecture. The ALU is made of circuits that perform logical and mathematical operations. The CU fetches and decodes instructions and tells the ALU what to do. The registers act as super-fast short-term memory for the CPU to store operation data in, and caches are slightly slower memory stores for data that the CPU might need to use repeatedly. What is a GPU? A GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit, is a physical chip inside your PC that's dedicated to processing graphics. A GPU is not the same as a graphics card, but graphics cards have GPU in them. A GPU is the chip inside the graphics card that does most of the rendering legwork. How a GPU works. GPU perform many simple tasks such as geometric calculations for rendering quickly and simultaneously. They can do this because they have a great many more cores than CPU do. An NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3080's GPU, for example, has 8,704 separate CUDA cores across 68 stream multiprocessors which are used for graphics rendering, after the CPU has told it to do so. The GPU takes in a large amount of data from memory and performs rendering calculations on all this data simultaneously or in very quick. What is GPU architecture? GPU are designed by GPU architects just like CPU are designed by CPU. Comparing CPU vs GPU architecture, we can see that the two components are designed for very different purposes. CPU are designed for complex, serial, step-by-step processing, and GPU are designed for simple, parallel, simultaneous processing. GPU share similar design to CPU in some ways. How both have shared memory caches and compute cores. For example, CPU vs GPU. GPU rendering is much quicker than CPU rendering. A CPU without an integrated GPU or a dedicated graphics card to delegate the task to will probably render graphics much slower than a GPU. When a game frame needs rendering, many things need to happen. For example, the entire game scene's geometry needs to be calculated, and so does its lighting. A lot of data also needs to be sampled. These calculations are pretty easy for a computer to perform, but there are so many of them to perform for just one game frame that a CPU can struggle, because it can only perform a limited number of operations at a time. Integrated graphics vs dedicated. Some CPU have GPU built alongside them in the same physical chip, which means they have integrated graphics. For example, AMD G processors like the Ryzen 5 5600G are accelerated processing units, APU that combine a CPU and GPU onto one chip. Many Intel processors have iGPU, integrated GPU, too. For example, the Z graphics built into many current-gen Alder Lakes. When using CPU with integrated graphics, rendering is usually performed by the integrated GPU. So, note that in these cases, Even though the graphics processing occurs on the processor's physical chip, it's still a GPU that's performing rendering, not the CPU. GPU vs CPU. A GPU processes graphics much quicker than a CPU, but GPU can't perform many other general tasks that the CPU performs, such as running an operating system and complex applications. CPU perform their tasks very well, and GPU perform their own tasks very well. But the GPU and CPU can't perform the others' tasks very well. Ultimately, both are needed to run a game smoothly at a comfortable frame rate. How much the CPU affects FPS in comparison to the GPU depends on the game. Games that require lots of complex simulations or logic, such as 4X games like Civilization VI, will rely heavily, and games that have very simple graphics and lighting won't require as much GPU legwork. CPU vs GPU. Bottlenecking is when one component inside your PC limits your PC overall capabilities by acting like the bottle of a neck that prevents liquid coming out at a faster rate. If one component is slow, this might prevent other components from utilizing their full power. A game that's being bottlenecked by the CPU or the GPU will suffer with lower FPS than the system is theoretically capable of if the bottlenecking component were upgraded. Both CPU and GPU bottlenecks can have the same symptoms, namely low FPS. Overview. Comparing a CPU vs GPU is like comparing an apple to an orange. They're very different in some ways, but similar in others, and having both together makes for a well-rounded fruit bowl. CPU and GPU are made from the same kinds of basic components but perform different tasks, and both together make for a much better graphical application experience. The CPU is like the brain of the computer, processing complex program instructions one after the other, but often, to a limited extent, also in parallel and telling other components what to do. We are almost wrapping up. These are the common differences between these two. Hope you like this video. Please comment, share, and subscribe to this channel for more videos.